Picture this. The year is 1258. A city that has stood as the intellectual capital of the Islamic world for 500 years is on fire. Its great library, the House of Wisdom, is being emptied book by book into the Tigris River, and there are so many manuscripts that survivors will later swear the water itself turned black with ink. Hundreds of thousands of people are dead. Baghdad, one of the largest, richest cities on earth, has ceased to exist in a matter of days. The man who ordered this was a grandson of Genghis Khan. Now picture something else entirely. A royal court in Beijing, decades later. Silk banners, foreign ambassadors, a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo standing in stunned silence at the sheer wealth on display, certain that no one back home will ever believe what he's about to describe. That court also belonged to a grandson of Genghis Khan. Same bloodline, same empire. Two men, two grandsons, two completely different worlds. One burned a civilization to the ground. The other became the emperor of the richest civilization on the planet. And they weren't the only ones. Two more grandsons built two more empires, one that would rule Russia for 2.5 centuries, and one that would simply dissolve into the sand. How does one empire become four completely different destinies? That's what we're unpacking today. This is the entire history of the Mongol successor Khanates, and it starts with a death. In 1227, Genghis Khan died in a tent on the steppe. In 25 years, he had built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, a realm stretching from the Sea of Japan to the edge of Europe. And the moment he was gone, everyone who inherited a piece of it had to answer the same terrifying question: how do you hold on to something this big? Here's what most people get wrong about the Mongol Empire. It was never really one empire in the way we think of Rome or China. It was closer to a family business. Genghis Khan had divided his territory among his sons while he was still alive, because Mongol custom demanded every son receive a share, whether that made political sense or not. His third son, Ogedei, became Great Khan, the supreme ruler over all of it. But his other sons, and later his grandsons, governed their own regions, technically loyal to the center, practically kings in everything but name. For a few decades, the system held. Ogedei kept expanding the empire deeper into China and further into Europe. But underneath the surface, the cracks were already spreading. Succession in Mongol tradition wasn't a clean line from father to eldest son. It went through councils, alliances, and, more often than anyone likes to admit, outright intimidation. Every transition of power was a crisis waiting to happen. By 1260, the crisis finally arrived. After decades of disputed elections and rising tension, Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai declared himself Great Khan. His own brother refused to accept it. What followed wasn't just a disagreement. It was a civil war between grandsons of the same conqueror, fighting over the same inheritance. The empire didn't just crack under that pressure, it split into 4 separate sovereign khanates, and each one went its own direction, becoming, in effect, 4 entirely different civilizations wearing the same family name. Think of it like a company built by one visionary founder, through sheer force of will. The moment he's gone, his 4 heirs each take their share and run it completely differently. One doubles down on the original vision and merges with the biggest market on earth. One gets absorbed by the culture it conquered. One rules through fear and distance for centuries, and one just quietly runs out of road. That's the next 250 years of Mongol history, compressed into a single image, and we're about to watch all 4 play out. Kublai Khan didn't just want to rule Mongols, he wanted to rule China. So he did something none of his ancestors had dared to do. He became Chinese. In 1271, Kublai declared the Yuan dynasty, adopting a Chinese-style imperial name, a Chinese-style bureaucracy, and eventually a rebuilt capital that we now know as Beijing. He finished the conquest of the Song dynasty in 1279, becoming the first foreign ruler in history to control the whole of China, north and south. Under Kublai, the Yuan court became the stuff of legend. This was the same capital that left Marco Polo so dazzled he assumed Europeans back home would accuse him of lying. Kublai patronized the arts, rebuilt the Grand Canal, and reopened trade routes that connected China to Persia, to Russia, and to Europe. The Silk Road at the absolute height of its power, made possible only because, for the first time in centuries, a single political network stretched across nearly the entire route. But there was a fatal flaw sitting underneath all of it. Kublai had become Chinese enough to rule China, but he was never quite Chinese enough for the Chinese to fully accept him. His descendants held the throne for less than a century. Floods, famine, and the crushing cost of running an empire this large bled the treasury dry. By the 1350s, rebellions were spreading like fire through dry grass across the countryside. In 1368, a former Buddhist monk turned rebel general named Zhu Yanjiang finally drove the Mongols out of Beijing and founded the Ming dynasty. The UN court fled north, back onto the steppe their ancestors had come from. Kublai's grandfather had conquered a continent on horseback. Kublai himself had built an empire so successful it made him a Chinese emperor, and within 100 years, China simply absorbed what remained of it and moved on, as though the Yuan dynasty had been a single long, extraordinary interruption. While Kublai was becoming an emperor in the east, his brother Hulagu was carving out an entirely different legacy in the west, the one we opened this video with. In 1258, Hulagu's armies besieged Baghdad, the intellectual and spiritual heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, and destroyed it almost completely. It remains one of the most devastating cultural losses in recorded history, and it's the founding trauma of what became the Ilkhanate, a Mongol state that stretched across Persia, Iraq, and the Caucasus. But here's the twist nobody sees coming. The very culture the Ilkhanate had just crushed began, slowly, to absorb its conquerors. Within 2 generations, the Mongol rulers of Persia stopped worshipping the sky god Tengri and started converting to Islam. By 1295, under a ruler named Ghazan Khan, Islam became the official religion of the Ilkhanate itself. The descendants of the men who burned Baghdad's libraries were now patronizing Persian poets, funding mosques, and commissioning some of the most breathtaking illuminated manuscripts in the history of Islamic art. It's one of the strangest transformations in world history. A conquest so total, it should have permanently erased a civilization, and instead, that civilization quietly conquered its conquerors from the inside, 1 generation at a time. The Ilkhanate didn't fall to some outside invasion. It fell apart from within, fracturing after 1335 into rival successor states, its unity a casualty of the exact same succession chaos that had doomed the wider empire decades earlier. The pattern just kept repeating. If you've ever wondered why Russian history looks the way it does, the centralized power, the deep-rooted suspicion of the West, that particular flavor of autocracy, the answer starts with the Golden Horde. Founded by Batu Khan, another grandson of Genghis, the Golden Horde swept across the Russian principalities through the 1230s and 1240s, burning Kiev to the ground and reducing dozens of Russian cities to rubble along the way. But unlike Hulagu in Persia, the Golden Horde never tried to directly administer their new territory. Instead, they ruled from a distance, through a system historians call the Mongol yoke. Russian princes kept their thrones, but only if they traveled to the Horde's capital, paid tribute, and swore personal loyalty to the Khan. That arrangement lasted, in one form or another, for almost 250 years. Sit with that for a second. 2.5 centuries of Russian princes bowing to Mongol Khans, collecting taxes on their behalf, competing viciously with each other for the Khan's favor. And one of those princes ruled a small, unremarkable trading town called Moscow. Moscow's rulers played this game better than anyone else on the board. They cooperated closely with the Horde, collected tribute efficiently, and used that hard-earned trust to slowly absorb power from rival Russian cities, one at a time. By the time the Golden Horde had fractured into weaker, competing Khanates in the 1400s, Moscow had grown strong enough to stop paying entirely. In 1480, Grand Prince Ivan III simply refused tribute outright, and the Horde, by then a shadow of its former self, couldn't do a thing about it. The empire that once conquered Russia had, without ever meaning to, quietly built the very state that would one day rise up and conquer it back. And then there's the Khanate most people have never even heard of. Named for Genghis Khan's second son Chagatai, this Khanate controlled Central Asia, the old heartland of the steppe, the deserts and oasis cities strung along the Silk Road. Unlike its siblings, the Chagatai Khanate never quite settled on an identity. It split, it reunited, it split again. Some rulers embraced Islam and settled into city life. The Derling tu Pintabentua Pern. Others clung fiercely to nomadic tradition and resented every step toward change. This identity crisis never fully resolved, and it left the Khanate permanently unstable, easy prey for any ambitious warlord looking to build something new on its ruins. That's exactly what happened. In the late 1300s, a brilliant and ruthless conqueror named Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, rose out of the wreckage of the Chagatai Khanate and built a devastating empire of his own, claiming descent from Genghis Khan to legitimize his rule, even though he wasn't a direct descendant at all. The Chagatai Khanate itself limped on in fragments for another 2 centuries, shrinking a little more with each generation, until it dissolved so quietly that historians still argue about exactly when it actually ended. Of the 4 Khanates, it's the one that never found an answer to the question every successor state eventually had to face. Are we still Mongols, or are we becoming something else entirely? By 1500, none of the 4 Khanates existed in anything close to their original form. The Yuan had been driven out of China. The Ilkhanate had dissolved into Persian successor dynasties. The Golden Horde had splintered into smaller Khanates that Russia would spend the next 300 years slowly, methodically conquering one by one. The Chagatai realm had been absorbed into Timur's empire and everything that came after it. But here's the thing worth sitting with before we close this out. The fall of the Khanates wasn't really a failure. It was these empires doing exactly what conquest states have always done throughout history, burning fast, spreading far, and then dissolving into the very cultures they conquered, leaving permanent fingerprints behind long after the armies were gone. Because of the Mongols, the Silk Road connected east and west more completely than at any point before the age of sailing ships. Because of the Mongols, Persian art, Chinese printing technology, and Islamic astronomy all moved across the largest trade network the world had ever seen. Because of the Mongols, an obscure trading post called Moscow rose to become the seed of an entire Russian state. Genghis Khan set out to conquer the world. What he actually did was rearrange it completely, and hand the pieces to 4 Khanates who, in trying to hold on to everything he built, ended up transforming into something even he never could have imagined. The Mongol Empire didn't end with one dramatic collapse. It ended the way most empires actually do. Slowly, unevenly, each piece finding its own separate way to disappear into history. If you want to understand the modern world, the borders on today's map, the ancient trade routes, the rise of Moscow, the shape of modern Iran and modern China, you have to start right here, with 4 Khanates, and the one question none of them could ever escape: what do you do with an empire once the man who built it is gone? If this video helped you finally understand a part of history nobody ever properly explained to you, that's exactly what this channel exists for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. Drop a comment telling me which Khanate you found the most fascinating. And if you're hungry for more of this cinematic, deep dive history, the next video is already waiting for you right now.